Thank you all for presenting the conference and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. This is intended to be, so this is going to be a lot more technical than any of the other talks. It's meant to be interactive. There'll be a few questions about your experience, and we'd love it if you would interact also. So today we're going to talk about optimization strategies for performance, efficiency, and sustainability. Specimen preparation for resin microscopy. This is differentiated from cryo, basically. For this talk, is used in TEM, SEM, volume EM, and even histology in some cases. The protocols are often optimized for a number of reasons, many of which is we've always done it this way. A particular lab already has reagents laying around, they've got techniques, and if you're in the middle of a study, you can't change your technique simply because you think you can do it a different way. There's reasons for the inertia to keep people from actually optimizing and innovating in their own lab. So today we'll discuss challenges, trends, tools, and strategies so you can analyze your work and potentially improve it. So what are the fundamental challenges? There's a paper, I consider it seminal, from 2007, Processing Tissue and Cells for TEM, etc., where they introduce empirically derived versus inherited methods. And inherited is the ones that you say you move to a new lab and they already have a way of doing things. You're just going to have to change to do it that way. However, if you do want to improve it, you can do some experiments and you can slightly change your protocol or drastically change your protocol. Many times there's traditions. One of the classics I like to bring up is catalase buffer versus phosphate buffer. And Bruno, who did a bio-EM talk with Pruching in our group, has a very firm opinion on that. I'm not going to open up that can of worms right now, but that's a particular one that people are diehard in their support for one particular approach, and they think everyone else is crazy in many cases. And the fact of the matter is both of them work. It depends on the details in many cases. There's also factors out of your control. Many times the samples arrive, they're already fixed, they've already in buffer, and your choice is just to continue with what they already have, in particular things like the buffer. And flexibility. Say you're in a core lab, someone brings you some samples, and they say, do it this way, and you can say, well, it's the equivalent of saying, bake me a cake. And you say, do you want my recipe or yours? And sometimes they're trying to replicate a paper exactly, and so you're going to use their recipe, but other cases, it's going to be, well, you're the core lab manager. Why don't you apply your expertise here and help me decide exactly how I want to generate this data to the best of your ability? And then what's available, what imaging modalities and tools you have also have a factor on what you're going to be doing. And then reagents as well. Back to the what's available. If you already have a lot of ethanol, you probably aren't going to start using acetonitrile or acetone or something else to do your dehydration. So what are the trends? Better EM scope cameras, enhanced contrast, so you perhaps cannot do post-staining. Digital processing can improve image quality. Images are data. This came up not too long ago. It's important to understand that you can't manipulate them too much because they're data and you need to be true to the actual controls and things like that you've already got in your protocol. Technicians are increasingly reluctant to handle toxic chemicals, especially when there's an alternative. Things like dehydration steps may be able to be condensed. I know when I first started, we were going 30, 50, 70, et cetera, et cetera. There are some resins out there, one from EMS called Hard Plus in particular, where right on the label it says only use 70%. So they dehydrate with acetonitrile, 70, 100, 100, so you can get rid of some steps if you want to. Of course, you'll have to do a parallel study to make sure that it still gives you the same results in pretty much every case. And UA restrictions, of course, in Europe it's more restricted than the US, and so you may be able to not even use some chemicals in your lab, and we'll have to look for alternatives. Now, are there any other trends that people are seeing out there? The changes that are going on in the microscopy world? Protocol design. Well, it depends. It depends on what? Well, the type of biological source we like to call it. So is it tissue? Is it cell pellets, monolayers? What is the type of the source? And then the organ. of the source tissue. Is it kidney? Is it brain? Of course, if there's more fat, you're going to treat it differently. If there's more, cardiac muscle is going to be a lot different from if you're looking for lipid, something like that. And then shaking times or agitation, we'll touch on that a little bit later. Then consider the target organelle. Are you looking for glomeruli, mitochondria, ER? All of these things will matter when it comes to designing your preparation protocol. And standardize for consistency when possible. Standardization and regulation in this case can be an advantage. And also over here, you want to always gross your sample so that at least one dimension is a millimeter, and preferably 2 dimensions are a millimeter, and then we like to do all 3 dimensions. So a cubic millimeter is what we consider the perfect sample size. People go smaller, you can go down to a few cells, or you can go bigger up to, a bouillon cube size if you want to. It's going to change how your incubation times for sure. Just a quick overview of the steps for anyone who hasn't done this much. It's fixation usually happens somewhere else. There's diffusion or there's immersion. You need to rinse the fix out. You're going to stain it with some heavy metal, or maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 if it's volume EM. M-block staining you can do during the protocol is optional. Dehydration, then you infiltrate, embed, polymerize, and trim. And so this is just an example workflow. So if you have a biopsy, which this crowd is probably doing kidney biopsies or other biopsies in most cases, you want to trim it to the desired size. Let's see what's going on. You want to trim it there, and then once you get into the workflow, it's similar in most cases. So you rinse it, you do secondary fixation or staining, some people call it. If you're doing the roto processing, this, for people who don't know, it's reduced osmium and then tetracarbohydrazine and then unreduced osmium. And the osmium is reduced with potassium ferrocyanate. And then you have to dehydrate it, infiltration, embedding, curing, and imaging. And I won't spend too much time on this one. The point is that the beginning part is what's different. So if you have some, and this was an actual sample of some tissue that came into the Medical College of Wisconsin, and it's cell pellets. They spin them down right here in the centrifuge, and then once you've got them, you can process them the same way you do anything else. And here we've got cell monolayers. And so if you have, for instance, human embryonic cells differentiated into astrocytes on cover slips or other types of material, it could be glass or it could be thermox, they would go into a 24-well plate. And you can be doing this manually. Full disclosure, I sell a robot called the Prep Master, and at the end of this, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, which is why we're doing everything in these 96-well format plates. It's called an SBS format plate. This is a 24-well version. So fixation. One thing I've noticed I came from a mass spectrometry background before this, and we tend to call our 0.1 molar PFA 0.1 molar PFA. The microscopy people like to name things after someone's name, so we talk quite often about Karnofsky's fixative. It has an actual formula that we'll discuss here a little bit. One thing about it, people think, oh, I can fix with anything, it'll be fine. If you want lipids, all cell components are well preserved except lipid droplets which are extracted, which that particular sentence is a surprise to some people who think that they can use Karnofsky's for just about anything. One thing about it, it's technically 2.5 glute, 2% formaldehyde. However, often, as you can see over here, this particular individual is using 1.5% glutaraldehyde and 2.5% paraformaldehyde. And then they will often call it modified Karnofsky's and not know exactly what the modification happens to be. Would that be accurate, Sarah? You think it's, it's called Karnofsky's, the modified, and then there's Sorensen's buffer, which is, I know exactly what it is, but 0.1 molar, 0.2 molar, phosphate buffer, phosphate buffered saline, PBS. I've seen all 4 called Sorensen's in a particular lab. Speaking of buffers, catalate, phosphate, there are many different buffers you can possibly use. Um, Moving right along, this is an example of centrifugation that I hadn't heard of before. Ruching had mentioned it to me, and you can use rapid embedding molds into epoxy and LR white for increasing concentration of resins. That this seminal work by Kent McDonald did back in 2014, so it's a little bit old. Rinsing. So if we go into Mazola or Hyatt, they typically, a lot of people, if you're doing a manual, you'll do 3 15-minute rinses. You want to use the same buffer. You have to consider the type of size, type, and density of your sample. Obviously, denser tissues will take longer. Lipid-rich may take longer. Agitation, shaking or rotating or moving your sample around helps every step, rinsing included. And you want to leverage strategic protocols for serial dilution. For instance, instead of 3 15-minute, you can do 5 1-minute rinses. And if you're going to be automating it, you can see over here we've got a shaker that the robot can put it in there. It goes for 1 minute. Then you do that 5 times, which you're effectively diluting it, 1 to 200. So the sample is a cubic millimeter. You're putting 200 microliters in. So you do a 200 times higher dilution 5 times, and the odds get astronomical, the dilution ratio. Types of agitation. So there's none, which are just setting it in the oven or setting it on the counter, let your sample sit there. There's a rotator. So people often use a rotating mixer, which is this one right here. Can you see that? Yep. A nutator. Before I was doing this talk, I didn't realize that. So the table that you can put your sample on that moves around like this, that's called a nutating mixer. And then you have some of the robots, and some of the ways are dunking. So you have the sample in some sort of basket, and you're dunking it in and out of a pool. And that's kind of, so the rotating we sometimes call sloshing. So you're sloshing it around, and this is sloshing, and this is actual dunking. And then you have actual shakers who will vibrate your sample or shake it very vigorously. And it's particularly important for timely and thorough infiltration. Also aspirate dispense fixing as well if you have one of these capsule-based systems. Heavy metal staining and rinsing. It's usually from 30 minutes to 2 hours on a cubic millimeter kidney tissue. If you have something denser like cardiac, you probably want to stain it a little longer. Typically in water. At this point, the osmium is changing your sample from the equivalent of a sponge into coral. And once you have it in that coral form or it's rigid like coral, you don't need to worry about the osmotic changes. And so people are trying to use, when you have the buffer, you don't want your sample to expand or contract. At this point, that's no longer an issue because it's been rigid. And so that's why often people use water and don't put any buffer in that. Consider the sample types and density. Dense tissues will take longer. Lipid-rich may take longer. Consider reducing your osmium with potassium ferrocyanate. That's borrowed from the volume EM roto protocol. And I'm seeing some people who will reduce their osmium simply to get better contrast on most of their samples. So it's something you can consider if you don't want to do post-staining in particular. And again, Bozilla and Hyatt both 3 by 15 or so. And if you're going to do it on any robot, not just the one we provide, you can do faster, more often rinses, faster rinses more often. So dehydration. Many protocols, I think, they start with ethanol, and then you would use some sort of transition solvent, and then use that same organic to mix up your resin. We've started using acetonitrile. Again, back to this hard press resin you can get from EMS. Right on the label, it suggests acetonitrile. From the robot engineer point of view, everything else equal, you want it to be the least evaporative. And that's where things like PO become problematic. Lots of protocols used to have PO. We're seeing less and less of that these days, at least I am. And acetone works well too. One of the first things we did. So I have a lab. I'm an honorary associate fellow of the School of Engineering at the University of Wisconsin. And it's near their core lab. And when I went in, they were using propylene oxide in the first place, and we did some parallel studies. Well, we sat down and we decided, okay, why don't we just pick one solvent? Why are we doing, ethanol, and then we're doing PO, and then we're doing acetone, and said, can we just pick one and run with it? And we did. And acetone worked well for us at first, and now we've turned to doing that with acetonitrile. And do you start at 50%? Do you start at 70%? There are protocols out there, and we published some things a few years ago in kidney renal samples that were run at the Medical College of Wisconsin, starting at 70%, doing 100%, 100%. The resin makes a choice. This is again paired with the hard plus resin. But all things equal, again, if you're in a clinical setting, getting the result back faster, as long as it's the quality is equal, is obviously better. And if you're not doing a long 5-7 step dehydration, you can do it in 3, then you're going to get that result to the patient faster. And patients are waiting. Agitation can help timely and thorough pressure infiltration. There's some devices out there. Some people use a vacuum oven, so that can help in some cases. There's a machine from EMS called the Poly 3 that alternates vacuum and heat to do some polymerization if you want to do it in a semi-automated way. Microwave assisted processing. So it's very popular. Some labs love it. You can do fast fixture, dehydration, etc. The problem is between each step, it's manually intensive. So yes, it's very fast. However, it's not very automated, or it's not that automatable. But highly manual, labor intensive, and they can be somewhat inconsistent and prone to thermal effects from the reports I've read. I have not done a lot of microwave assisted processing myself. And that's one thing about the robotics. They're not quite as fast, the state of the art this day, as microwave, but it's approaching that point where the fact that it's hands-free is as good as the fact that it's fast. Strategies for efficiency and productivity, overall strategy. So look to Big Pharma for some of these tools. And I'll back up a little bit. My company's Heartland Biotech. Our theme is to expand the reach of high technology from the privileged few to the deserving many. Privileged few in the robotics world, lab robotics in particular, is Big Pharma. Big Pharma, if you go to those places, they have all the great robots and all the great processing and everything you possibly want. And then the deserving many are the technicians that are working in the basements of hospitals around the U.S., doing electron microscopy, doing things like putting chemo cocktails together. So that's another unmet need, is there's people that are getting the chemo drugs in their blood. And there was a study that I read. It was like, well, what's an acceptable level? It's like lead, none. And so what you need to do is build a machine that will do that so the human doesn't have to. What else can you do? Use walk-up automation, obviously. Prepare your samples earlier and dispense them perhaps in a easy-to-use container so that you have the exact same thing for a week or a month or so. Always consider Occam's razor. If there's 2 or 3 ways to do something, the one with the least steps is probably the best way. And time is money. Staff time is precious. And meaning people in your lab, they can be doing sample prep, microtomy, and image analysis. If you ask anyone of those 3 things they like the least, it is very likely to be the sample prep part is the one they'd like to get rid of. And this is just an example of some of the automated systems out there. Over here, you've got just a plain old pipetter. So if you want to get a plate, do it by hand. That's one option. I've got the 8-channel here, a single channel here. This is an example of having all of your reagents pre-pipetted into a convenient cartridge, we'll call that. So there's buffer, there's osmium, water for rinsing out your osmium, and then your dehydration reagents and resin. This is the Prep Master. That's the one I prefer there. This is one called the MPrep ASP 1000. And this is a Lynx 2, and this is the EMTP from Leica, which is probably the one with the largest install base as we speak. Strategies use mechanical agitation to improve reagent penetration. Consider alternative dehydration and embedding. There's some resins that aren't used quite often. This Hard Plus I mentioned, this Ketol 651, it has some interesting properties. Low viscosity epoxy resin for embedding biological tissues and can act as a dehydration agent itself. I have not used it firsthand, but it's something one day I hope I get the opportunity to do. Conserve per sample cost. Try to use as little plastic as you can without compromising quality, of course. You can be efficient and sustainable at the same time. Use smaller volumes and do more of them is one strategy. And you want to optimize, of course, for quality. You can optimize for speed, you can optimize for cost, you can, of course, but quality is always job one. But you can also optimize throughput, cost, speed, reproducibility, sustainability, and additional strategies. If practical, try to use one solvent. Then you don't have to worry about having multiple solvents. And then, just a good idea to keep the expanding or contracting of your sample. The fewer different things you have, it's just intuitive. The fewer changes you're giving your sample, the less likely it is to get out of the range where you want it to stay size-wise. Deactivating your osmium. Most people use, or I've seen that quite often people use corn oil. You can use your spent ethanol. You can take your spent ethanol, put it in your osmium, and that will deactivate it. Some people have reused UA. The guys there at Wisconsin do it all the time and don't seem to have any detrimental effect. And go to the Slack channel. I'm not sure if everyone knows about that, but there's a Slack is an online destination. People can go, and there's one called EM of Cells, Tissues, and Organisms. So if you're not on there already, you either go there yourself or contact me and I can send you an invitation link. Little tangent here. So Core Labs, efficiency, fairness, and excellence. So at University of South Carolina, not far from here, they're doing some pretty heroic work for efficiency, fairness, and excellence, the case for centralized research infrastructure. A lot of this is about sharing instruments on a particular campus. And there's different silos in different places. And sometimes it's easy to go use some technology that's not far away. And sometimes it's not so easy. And so what they're trying to do is have transparent policies and a centralized intake portal to level the field so that everyone has access to all the technology possible on their particular campus. And some future topics. I'll stop here a little bit. I think you all have met Ruching back in the corner there, but we both work on what's called bio-EM talks. And there will be one in a week where we're going to have some of the speakers from here doing talks on specifically, things that were discussed here in the first place on multistructural pathology. There's a sample prep working group that's part of the European, the electron microscopy image archive. The goal is to make a tool to enter type, organ, and target, and it will come up with a protocol for you. It's going to be quite an effort. We just met on last week and still are on step one. But also how to select your resin. One thing, a lot of people just use the resin that they have laying around, Embed 812 or some sort of epoxy. But we're going to look at some ways to intuitively go down some sort of algorithmic path to see which resin's best one for you, and to promote more online learning resources. And also, as Eric and some of us were talking about just yesterday, of expanding to do some webinars or the same type of bio-EM talks that are specific for the UltraPath group. If you do have other suggestions for us to do either with UltraPath or with bio-EM talks, certainly bioemtalks@gmail.com is an opportunity for you to submit that request. Speaking of bio-EM talks, if you want to get on our email list, just go to the website, bioemtalks.com, go to the bottom, subscribe, and we'll start sending you invitations to all of our events. Including, for instance, there's a 2026 Volume EM in Beijing conference coming up that we'll be talking about tomorrow. And what is the date on that, Ruching? Okay, yeah, October 11 through 15 in Beijing. But I just got the slide not too long ago, or I have it on here, but we'll certainly have information on that on the BioEM talks that's coming up on Thursday, the 21st of next week. And a little bit of advertising. So what if you could put your simple tells in a robot, post the holder in a robot, and go? Well, now you can. We're sponsored by the Prepmaster 5100. So sorry for the commercial part there, but that is kind of how I feed my children. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Well, we will hold the question until.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Now we have the last talk of this session. We, as the diagnostic pathologists, tend to make the diagnosis of fungal infection based on light microscopy with the aid of few histochemical stains. Now, Dr. John Bisley will tell us that electron microscopy may be very essential and instrumental using that process through his another interesting report on the cryptococcal infection of the lung. Dr. Bisley.
Thank you very much. It's so heartening to hear earlier how red wine is so good for you. So we proved that last night, I think.
Not this morning.
Not this morning, no. Anyway, this is a case, we don't see many infectious diseases cases, so this was new for me, so I thought I would present it for you. Okay, so all we knew was this was a male, age 8, with 2 weeks of exercise intolerance. He had a right cavitating lung lesion on CT of the chest with peripheral calcified nodular lesions. So yeah, we received a little bit of this specimen. Quite often we look at the EM before anything else has been done in our lab, and this was such a case. There was no light microscopy or anything when we were preparing the toll blues. So we looked at them. The tissue was entirely necrotic. There was no viable lung parenchyma. There were occasional small round cells noted. And I thought, well, that looks like something unusual. We should cut some thin sections. So this was our survey section with telluride blue. And I'm sure you can see there's a few round structures that typically you wouldn't think would be present. And everything else is necrotic. You can barely work out a nucleus from cytoplasm, and it's all falling apart. But we cut it anyway. That looks suspicious. And we saw this. So you can see the necrotic cells down here, a few lipid droplets. And then there are these other structures that are round and unusual looking. So I wasn't sure what they were. And just to give you a few more images, some of them look like they're on fire, and some are more regular looking. So I thought, well, these look like bugs, but I'm not sure what they are. They had a thick cell wall and a fairly nondescript center. And this sort of baffled me. I thought, if this is what I think it is, surely I should be seeing some organelles. But they all look like this, so I wasn't sure what to make of that. Just this reticular-looking core. Some of them look like this, and when you're unsure about things on infectious diseases, I did show this to Dr. Sarah Miller, and she was straight onto it. She said this is a tangential section through the edge of one of these bugs, and you're getting a real good look at the capsule coming out. And this is the tangential section through the bug here. So she was most impressed by that, and so was I. So I measured them, and they're ovoid, and they were 5 microns in that plane of section, with a thick cell wall and a bit of capsule. And all this time, we didn't have any other light microscopy. So as I said, I contacted Sarah, and I've even gone back to one of her presentations that I've got on file from a previous ultrastructural pathology meeting, her excellent 4-part series, and this was from part B. And there was a couple of similar looking bugs in this page on yeasts, and her comments here were that the yeasts are about 5 microns. Well, that was spot on for what we were finding. They're ovoid in shape, which was what we were finding. They've got a thick cell wall. I didn't see any budding organisms, but I did see the capsule. So that seemed to fit fairly well for a yeast. Here's a couple of budding yeasts here, and here's one invading cells. So that looked fairly regular and similar to what we had. I looked further into it, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. I call it the Green Book. There's a Green Book and a Blue Book by Papa Demetrio, Henderson, and Spagnolo. The Chapter 9 by Dr. Ted Wills, who was mentioned earlier this week, he authored the chapter on infectious agents, fungi, bacteria, and viruses. And in the book, he's got a picture of pulmonary cryptococcus with viable and degenerate yeasts. So I'm thinking some of these with the organelles are more viable, and some of them are degenerate, but you can see the capsule. So that seemed to match fairly well with what we had. So then I had to think, well, what are the options? And this is not an area that I'm really familiar with, but I'm thinking, could they be, is it Candida or Candida? I tend to say Candida, but that was a song from 1970. So maybe it's Candida. Anyway, I thought unlikely. This is a commensal organism, a normal component of the human biome. Then there's histoplasma, but apparently it can't be histoplasma. It does not form a capsule. Then there was Cryptococcus was another possibility. And I don't know, there's probably others. There's probably lots. But since this is not really our area of expertise, that was what I was working on. So I reported to the pathologist that there's no viable lung parenchyma. Microorganisms are identified. They're ultrastructurally consistent with yeast, and query Cryptococcus species. I thought that was a pretty good summary of what we had. So eventually the light microscopy was available, and this is an H&E stain showing the necrotic debris, and you can see the yeasts in amongst the necrosis. And this was such a beautiful image that I had to include it. This is a cresol violet stain, birefringence under polarized light, and it highlights the yeast capsule, and it's called the starburst pattern. I had to check with the pathologist what this was, but had to include it. It's a beautiful stain. So the pathologist then issued the report as tissue entirely necrotic, no viable lung parenchyma, multiple spirilla encapsulated yeast forms. And there was follow-up studies. The serology confirmed Cryptococcus, and the mycology, Cryptococcus was identified using the India ink stain. Culture remained negative after 4 weeks, therefore species identification was not possible. So putting all that together, the pathologist issued an integrated diagnosis with necrotic tissue with fungal organisms consistent with Cryptococcus species. So I thought I'd look into it a little bit further, and I believe the most common cryptococci, Cryptococcus neoformans, which is globally distributed, typically affects immunocompromised individuals. And then there's Cryptococcus gattii, which is strongly associated with Australian native trees, such as eucalyptus, river red gum, and the surrounding soil. And that piqued my attention when I read that. I thought perhaps I've got a uniquely Australian story to tell you. So I emailed Dr. Sarah Kidd. She's the head of our mycology department in South Australia, and I think she's the Australian coordinator of all mycology. She said she studied Cryptococcus gattii in British Columbia in Canada, where there are no river red gum trees, and it is now endemic there. So her advice is to resist the temptation to draw a link between Cryptococcus and gum trees. But I think it was a tantalizing thought. So in closing, if anything, this case highlights that in some instances, EM can be contributory in the examination of necrotic tissue. Thank you for your attention.